This book, The Republic, is one of the oldest philosophical texts and also one of the oldest works of political theory. Among the many different subjects that are explored by Plato in the book is the regime cycle, or anacyclosis, which is essentially his theory of how societies rise and fall. Let's see if we can apply that to the United States. Some of the loudest groups in our society desperately want us to believe that politics is only about the competing material interests of various groups. Whether it's economic class or racial competition, we're told that questions of right and wrong, good and evil, are merely illusions designed to distract us from the cynical calculus of power. But what if politics is just the sum total of everything that happens in society? The titular republic is a city in speech, as Plato puts it. It starts out as a perfectly integrated society with all of its pieces working together in tandem, and proceeds to degenerate through various stages until presumably starting again. Each phase of the cycle is based on which part of the human personality is dominant at the time: reason, honor, or desire, with oligarchy and democracy acting as sort of transition phases. The first stage of the regime cycle is aristocracy, or the government of reason. Long story short, to Plato, this means a society governed by philosopher kings, which are essentially kings with good intentions. To Plato, good intentions would mean the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty, which are all the same thing. Why is the aristocracy a monarchy? This is because Plato believed that of the three parts of what he calls the soul, which is really closer to what we'd call the personality in modern terminology, reason is the smallest. Therefore, it's very rare to find someone whose actions are truly governed by reason and not their sense of honor or desire. As a matter of fact, he thought there needed to be a special class of people from whom the monarchs were chosen that were trained and educated from birth for this express purpose. Hence why the first stage is called aristocracy and not just monarchy. A society in which philosopher kings rule is an aristocracy. And a person ruled by reason could be called an aristocrat of the spirit, perhaps. Yeah, I just said that. So now that we have that out of the way, you might be wondering how any of this could apply to the US, as we've always had ostensibly democratic institutions. This apparent contradiction is actually due to a fundamental disagreement between ancient and modern conceptions of politics. Plato, and indeed Aristotle's conception of politics, is much more about values than institutions. To them, democracy is about the value of freedom above all else, which quickly degenerates into mob rule. The US may have never been technically ruled by philosopher kings, but it certainly had philosopher founders. The Founding Fathers' goal was to found a nation with historical hindsight precisely in order to prevent mob rule from happening, as it had in other societies with democratic institutions. They were well-educated landowners. They were familiar with the thought of Plato as well as other ancient philosophers like Polybius and Cicero, who both iterated on the ideas of Plato and advocated building societies with mixed institutions in order to prevent their collapse. John Adams, for example, in his defense of the United States government, referenced Polybius, who is once again an ancient Greek historian that applied Plato and Aristotle's analysis to the Roman Republic. Polybius concluded that the Romans were able to have successful democratic institutions because they combined them with other forms of rule. This also explains why it can be useful to differentiate between a democratic republic and a true democracy. This distinction is often thrown around by people who can't explain what it actually means, but if you ask Polybius, he'd say that a society which uses democratic institutions, carefully balanced with others as a means to an end in order to achieve the pursuit of the common good, is not truly a democracy. It's a republic, because there's a sense of intent. A democracy is a government that values negative freedom above all else, which is essentially letting people do whatever they want regardless of harm to themselves or others. The distinction between negative and positive freedom is going to be a reoccurring theme in this video. So in this sense, the United States was founded as something closer to a Platonic aristocracy than a democracy, with democratic institutions merely being a means to an end. After all, the Declaration of Independence speaks of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the rights of man, not just liberty. The pursuit of happiness gestures to positive freedom, or the ability to choose good outcomes. Institutions such as checks and balances, as well as the American civic religion, served as a constant reminder of our country's values. These were put in place in order to create a society that was simultaneously free, stable, and conducive to positive life outcomes, which I think is the kind of society that we all want. It's also, frankly, important to distinguish between voters and decision makers. For much of American history, for better or for worse, the social contract has involved a specialized class of decision makers to which people trusted. These decision makers took various forms. First, it was landowners, then union and party bureaucracy, then finally think tanks and special interest groups that functioned like a well-oiled machine. But all of them were generally tied to the university system, which exists for the purpose of training the political class, similarly to Plato's aristocracy. When Plato used the term democracy, he was clearly referring to something that more closely resembled what we now call populism. Populism has always been a force in American politics, to be sure, from Jacksonian democracy to robber barons. But people were generally willing to defer to what we now call the experts. And just to be clear, no, I don't think the problem with society is that people aren't letting the elites cook enough, and neither did Plato. As a matter of fact, part of what causes the societal decline he talked about is the corruption of the elite. You can't expect people to trust the experts when the experts start abusing their position and lying to the people. That being said, a democratic society in which people are still largely willing to defer to trusted institutions and authority figures would not be a true democracy in Plato's mind. So, when did the decline begin? It's tempting to say the Civil War, obviously, but I think this is a complete red herring. Plato's aristocracy was an attempt to describe a borderline utopian society with all of its components working in unison. Regardless of what you think of the Founding Fathers, the country they created was not perfect, and Plato wouldn't have been shocked by this. Nothing closely resembling his perfect aristocracy existed in his day, nor has ever existed before or since. After all, his society contained gender equality, communism, and a seemingly random sex lottery that actually selected for the most genetically superior individuals.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Part of Plato's conception of good and his famous theory of forms is that we're always working towards better versions of the world and ourselves, to which we often fall short. The aristocracy in the Republic is supposed to be a perfect aristocracy, and maybe the longest lasting and most stable one Plato could imagine, but I don't think it was supposed to be the only one that could ever exist. So in a real-world Platonic aristocracy, of course some internal strife is to be expected along with the differences in institutions. However, the main reason that the Civil War was not part of the regime cycle is that the US, in my opinion, emerged from it stronger than before. We have to remember that the regime cycle is not just about a society becoming more violent and chaotic, but a loss of values over time. The Civil War could be looked at as a consolidation of the values of the US, a triumph of virtue over convenience, and perhaps even a sort of second founding. After all, Plato, and indeed no other ancient philosopher, ever even considered the ethics of slavery as an institution, and the US abolished it on ethical grounds. If the Civil War wasn't the beginning of American anacyclosis, then when? In the Republic, the collapse of the aristocracy begins due to the failure of the enigmatic birthing number to be calculated properly, which is part of the aforementioned eugenics scheme. How this number is calculated actually involves astrology and is one of the most opaque and confusing aspects of the book. Regardless, it's plain in Socrates' narrative that the failure to calculate it is not a moral or structural failure of the society, but merely a mathematical error, a function of entropy. So at first, this error has no effect, but over the years, the problems begin to snowball and result in visible social dysfunction. Therefore, those committed to action and honor, the warrior class, step in to try and fix things, and thusly we enter democracy, the society of honor and action, which I think most closely fits with the World War II generation, and no, not just because they fought in a war. Why do I think this? Well, first, we need to make one more quick digression to understand what Plato meant by honor. This is the last thing like this, so bear with me. In short, honor could be described as the desire to be a part of something greater than yourself and specifically to fight for it. I think how misunderstood this concept is today is one of the biggest indications that Plato's regime cycle might be correct, actually. Many people of all ages today will argue with you to the ends of the earth that everyone fears death more than anything, despite the majority of human history making no sense if that's the case. Yeah, Napoleonic soldiers lined up to get their arms and legs blown off with muskets because the pay was just so good. I mean, how much money would it take for you to roll the dice on confronting your ultimate fear in the most direct way possible again and again for months on end? Apparently, however much Napoleon was paying his soldiers. Or maybe they had other priorities than avoiding death at all costs. With that out of the way, during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, the World War II generation, or the Greatest Generation as they're sometimes called, witnessed the mass institutional failure of society to provide for its people. At the height of the Depression, 24% of people were unemployed and wages had fallen by 42%. This would be your entropy issue. The Founding Fathers had no way of accounting for things like a massive stock market and an interconnected global industrial economy when they designed a country essentially from scratch, although some of them were certainly skeptical of wage labor and economic centralization. The Depression created a generation of people disenfranchised and without opportunity. Interestingly, much of what we think of as American pop culture was invented or popularized at this time, including westerns, gangster movies, and superhero comics like Batman and Superman. Much of this fiction was about individualistic heroes triumphing over their circumstances through sheer force of will and bringing order to a chaotic world, which is precisely how Plato described the Timocratic personality as viewing itself. This generation was not completely cooked, as the kids say, because they would find economic and perhaps even cultural salvation in World War II. Although America was reluctant initially to get involved in the war, this generation would quickly find themselves fighting for what many viewed as a worthy and just cause of massive historical importance. The cultural reaction to the war can be seen in the fact that 32% of service members in World War II were volunteers. The idea behind the Timocratic society is that the society becomes increasingly action-oriented in order to deal with problems which seemingly come out of nowhere. While it's debatable whether war between the US and the Axis powers was inevitable, it can't be denied that the Depression was a large factor in Hitler's rise to power. Although the Depression started in the US, it was in fact global, and it hit Germany particularly hard when they were already dealing with myriad social, political, and economic issues after losing World War I. But the far more characteristic, and in my opinion, inevitable aspect of the Greatest Generation's politics was domestic. Military action was paralleled with political action on the home front, with FDR, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, also providing over new economic policies created to help the working class and poor, and a new era of power for unions. In this way, FDR was almost a perfect example of a leader of a democratic society, a military leader and social crusader elevated to an almost kingly status. I think if the massive demand for weapons in Europe had not saved the U.S. economy, it's likely we would have seen even greater economic intervention domestically, and perhaps even a much larger and more organized American labor movement, maybe even a socialist one. We tend to think of people in the past as being more conservative than we are, but baby boomers and neoliberalism have altered our perception of what conservatism even means. Unlike boomers, the politics of the World War II generation remained mostly unchanged over the course of their lives. They were patriotic, socially conservative, and civic-minded, but they didn't really care about the free market as much and were often very pro-union. The functioning of unions is largely part of personal politics and, yes, honor, far removed from the impersonal market dynamics that later generations would expect to govern the economy. Unions, up until the 1970s, were some of the largest interest groups in politics, and it was essential for many politicians to win their endorsement. This is the era of American history when worker power was at its height, with 33.5% of workers being unionized in 1954, as opposed to 10% today. The picture becomes even more clear when we look at how the Democrats governed when they got into office.
Poverty is not a trait of character. It is created by circumstances. 30 million Americans live in poverty. So will their children, unless the cycle is broken. That's the goal of President Johnson's war on poverty. Help win it. Vote for him on November 3rd.
Presidents JFK, LBJ, and Nixon were all veterans of World War II and members of this generation, and all three of them held some degree of the blame for the disaster of Vietnam. JFK himself was viewed as a social reformer and a giver of great speeches. Speeches seem very in line with the concept of democracy to me. They're the kind of thing that riles people up and makes them want to live and die for big ideas.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
Notice the rhetorical framing used by both LBJ and Kennedy. LBJ wants you to help win his war on poverty. The moon landing isn't framed in terms of scientific progress or knowledge, but as a dangerous adventure undertaken for no reason other than to prove a point. LBJ was even more of a reformer than JFK, by the way. I mean, he presided over the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, an aspect of his presidency that's often strangely overlooked. Furthermore, he created something called the Great Society Program, which was meant to improve on and expand the legacy of the New Deal with further social and economic reforms with a view towards social justice, including Medicare. We can perhaps see in the figure of Nixon the dark side of the Democrat. Many political scientists have even gone so far as to describe him as the Shadow the Hedgehog of presidents. His politics were hard to pin down, reflecting a broader identity crisis in the Republican Party. While ambivalent to unions, he also worked closely with them and was able to win the endorsement of some big unions. He engaged in interventionist economic policies which would be unthinkable to future neoliberals, like unilaterally freezing wages and prices, and the creation of OSHA. However, it could be said that his insecurity and obsession with winning led to Watergate, if you don't think Watergate was a CIA psyop to get rid of Nixon, but that's a subject for another video. Also, JFK was killed by the CIA. The Vietnam War, as well, is an example of how this action-oriented mindset can be a bad thing. It arguably led Kennedy to begin airstrikes on the country, LBJ to fully commit U.S. forces, and Nixon to withdraw far too late while bombing Cambodia on the way out.
You see this watch? You see this watch? Yeah. That watch costs more than your car. I made $970,000 last year. How much you make? You see, pal, that's who I am, and you're nothing.
After the Democrats, Plato said, would come the oligarchic society, a society ruled by the pursuit of money. The children of the democratic society would eventually become disillusioned with their parents' values, seeing money-making as the far more practical pursuit, and thus becoming one more step removed from the pursuit of justice. This can be seen in the baby boomer generation, which presided over neoliberalism becoming the dominant ideology in American politics for decades. Neoliberalism could be said to be the removal of all constraints on economic growth and basing policy around what's good for business, which is indeed a form of oligarchy. During the neoliberal revolution, which arguably started with Reagan and continued until the presidency of Obama, unions were almost completely defanged and business lobbying filled that power vacuum. Both political parties and the government began to have their policy dictated by think tanks, lobbyists, and interest groups that put economic growth and business interests first. Regulations were cut, government programs were privatized, and this is important, the American people supported it. This is because the belief at the time was that whatever was good for business was good for the economy, and whatever was good for the economy was good for society. This is far removed from the interventionist economic philosophy of the Great Society or the New Deal. How exactly did the boomers end up like this? Their parents' generation, after all, came out of World War II richer than before and benefiting from tons of subsidized programs. Many of them would move to the newly created suburbs, themselves largely a byproduct of government planning.
Distinctive architectural details create a lovely setting that enhance the pleasure of entertaining.
Many of them had started families, which is where the term baby boom, of course, comes from. So, where did baby boomers get the idea that their parents didn't see the true value of money making? For one, from stagflation, also known as the malaise. In the 1970s, many people viewed the U.S. as being in an economic and political crisis. Growth had stopped, Yet prices continued to rise, causing Nixon to implement the aforementioned wage price freeze. The causes of stagflation are a sore and extremely controversial subject for those interested in economics or American history, perhaps maybe one of the most controversial subjects. But the narrative that seemed to prevail at the time was that the political and economic order dominated by unions, social programs, and government intervention had failed. Equity and social justice were honorable, but in order for the economy to function, they needed to be replaced with something more practical. However, only younger boomers would have come of age during the malaise. That being said, the neoliberal backlash was the culmination of a feeling of disenchantment many people had been feeling their whole lives. Along with the natural tendency of children to want to be different from their parents, one of the most important human characteristics, there was also the Vietnam War, which was arguably the defining political moment of the boomers' youth. It largely soured their trust in their parents' worldview, as well as of government itself. Many young people saw the war as pointless, a waste of money and lives on both sides. They resented their parents' blind patriotism and militarism, especially the expectation that they not complain about being drafted into a war that, unlike World War II, did not seem incredibly consequential. In response, we saw the 60s counterculture exemplified by the hippie movement, which attempted to reject all social standards and return to a sort of imagined primordial state of man. This might sound like the kind of thing Plato would hate, but quite the opposite is true. If you look up Plato or Socrates' ideal society, most of Plato's works are, of course, fan fiction about his teacher for some reason, most people online will say that it was the aristocracy I previously described, but that's actually not correct. While many aspects of Plato's aristocracy have been compared to communism by later scholars, his actual ideal society, which he calls the true and healthy city, is just communist. It's a society where there's no money, no government, and no laws. It operates on the principle of each according to their needs, from each according to their ability. Furthermore, people lounge around all day and work as little as possible. Socrates just didn't believe that this society was feasible due to the existence of human greed and excess. And so too, the hippie movement, while somewhat noble, was just far too broad, unrealistic, and lacking in any kind of firm political vision. Baby boomers would retreat to their parents' conservative social values with age. Plato talks about the fact that the oligarchic society alternates almost schizophrenically between being extremely moralistic and immoral. This is due to the fact that they fixate on money. Money is a sort of stored potential energy that can be used on anything from charity to investment to mindless consumption. In order to make money, you need to think rationally and intelligently to save, plan, and invest accordingly. On the other hand, after a certain point, money is really only a means to an end to satisfy desire. A Platonic oligarchy values money for its own sake without making prescriptions for what it should be spent on. This creates a moral crisis, a shattered personality that can be selfish but not hedonistic. The collective boomer psyche and quest for meaning is at the heart of much of the more absurd and contradictory elements of American politics. For example, many boomers would dogmatically embrace the born-again or evangelical Christian movement.
The apostles were businessmen. They were rich men, had plenty of money. I'm going to show you that Jesus was a wealthy man, had plenty of money. And see, all of that completely foreign to us from a traditional point of view.
Which insisted on strict adherence to Scripture while seemingly ignoring biblical teachings about charity, empathy, and withholding judgment of your neighbor. With the best example of this bizarre worldview being perhaps megachurches and prosperity gospel, which attempted to integrate consumerism and capitalist spectacle into Christianity.
There will be 50 people give $1,000, and do it right now, or I am finished. Now try me.
And if you'll call during this telecast, for you that support our ministry in any way, just call the number on your screen. We'll rush this out to you. Many of you during this time of year need to anoint your billfold with this oil for a financial blessing.
One of the things that occurs in Christianity is that it's not pain-free. And in teaching about offenses, I found it very effective to mention the kinds of offenses that come in Scripture. The word offense in the Greek is scandalon, and it refers to the bait of a trap. This is an old Texas rat trap, and I've smashed many a finger on this thing trying to show this message. And when you put the bait on this trigger, that trigger is called the scandalon. That's the offense. And if you reach for the offense to be offended because you are, an animal reaches for it to eat it, but a Christian reaches for the offense because he's hurt.
And just to be clear, I'm not one of those people who hates Protestants, and I even think that there's good elements to evangelical Christianity, but I think you get the idea.
God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives.
There are, perhaps, in my opinion, 3 notable exceptions to this cycle, 2 of which are Gen X and the Silent Generation. The Silent Generation is the generation between the World War II generation and the baby boomers. People born during the war, for those of you who... Oh, no, that's not true. It's the generation between the World War II generation and the baby boomers, for those of you who don't know. Both the Silent Generation and Gen X are rarely talked about in the grand scheme of things compared to the others that I've mentioned. They're smaller generations. If you ask me, within the framework of anacyclosis, these generations are closer to being aristocratic than anything. They were, like the hippies, countercultural, but there was a much more clear focus on authenticity, self-discovery, and personal responsibility, rather than a simple and easy fix to all of society's problems. The Beat Generation, as the Silent Generation is sometimes called, are often associated with jazz music, poetry, and literature. But the term beat doesn't refer to music. It refers to being beaten down by life. Jack Kerouac, one of the greatest writers of this generation, put it best. Beatific, beautiful in an ugly new way. A vision gleaned from the way we had heard the word beat spoken on the street corners of Times Square and in the Village.
Jack, got a couple of square questions, but I think the answer will be interesting. How long did it take you to write On the Road?
3 weeks.
How many?
3 weeks.
3 weeks? Jeez, that's amazing. How long were you on the road itself?
7 years.
7 years. Yeah, I was on the road once for 3 weeks, and it took me 7 years to write about it.
The Gen X attitude can be seen in the music of bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, as well as films such as Trainspotting, Fight Club, and The Matrix. It's an attitude of jaded detachment, but like the Beatniks, also one of yearning for deeper, transcendent experiences. Poetry had gone out of fashion by the time of Gen X, but they still made use of the spoken word in the form of stand-up comedians like Dave Chappelle, Bill Hicks, and David Cross, who often blurred the line between poetry, social commentary, and comedy.
There is a point. Is there a point to all this? Let's find a point. Is there a point to my act? I would say there is. I have to. The world is like a ride at an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. And the ride goes up and down and round and round. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us, and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride, and we kill those people.
I think Gen Alpha may end up being one of these generations as well. They're a smaller generation and seem to have a similar detached attitude. The problem with these generations is, if it is a problem, is that they don't really have any interest in changing society due to a combination of indifference and perhaps what could be called humility. If we're going by the Republic, this would actually support the idea of them retaining a somewhat aristocratic attitude. Plato thought that someone who truly valued reason in a fallen society would appear rather lazy to most people because they'd prefer sitting around with their own thoughts to trying to get involved in other people's business. This is something I think Plato was fundamentally correct about. A lot of the most respectable people I've known have had the appearance of being lazy. But the children of Gen X would still come of age in a society dominated by the moralizing schizophrenia of the much larger millennial and boomer generations. Even if we accept that Gen X was closer to being aristocratic than any previous generation, this was no longer an aristocratic society. Gen X was not in charge. Gen X had a very hands-off approach to parenting, at least when it came to media, at least when it came to the media that their children consumed and the types of ideas and people they were exposed to. I think we in Gen Z are very much creatures of the world, and for many of us, our parents' attitude of just not caring wasn't enough.
I see so many people comment all the time, oh, just keep me like that forever. I have the exact same sentiments. I know exactly what you mean. I know what you're feeling. However, do you really think that you could spend 3 days in a cage?
Millennials, corresponding to the Democratic generation, came of age during unprecedented economic prosperity. By the 1990s, America was the #1 economy in the world and had a balanced budget. While the lack of regulation would arguably lead to the 2008 financial crisis, these cracks in the system were not yet visible. We had created arguably the most free and most technologically advanced society in human history and dominated global politics culturally and militarily as well. From this point of view, neoliberalism was a success, at least at first. As a matter of fact, it was so successful that Francis Fukuyama's End of History, the idea that America had discovered the perfect political system which would never fail, was a popular belief. This was a pervasive feeling at the time. It's certainly how I felt as a kid. It felt like the US had essentially figured out politics and economics forever and things would never change. This indeed goes along with Plato's theory. He described democratic societies which value negative freedom above all else, as being the most beautiful and, yes, the most diverse. When Plato talked about diversity, he meant diversity of personalities, but presumably a diversity of cultures as well. This fits very much with America's view of itself in the 90s, a morally superior and truly free melting pot of all the people of the world. But Plato also saw this as the beginning of the end. This generation, he wrote, would see the absurdity of their parents' beliefs and embrace something more clear, absolute freedom. Millennials seem to be defined by an extreme skepticism of their parents' beliefs of social conservatism and pro-capitalism. This can be seen in their deep interest in Marxism as well as other far-left ideologies unseen in the United States for decades. Also political figures like Bernie Sanders and the Squad, as well as BreadTube and various left-wing political commentators in the 2010s. This generation is very concerned with dismantling hierarchies in the name of attaining true freedom. But the freedom to do what?
Hi everyone, I'm Switch, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my long-term rubber GIMP bondage experiences. So specifically, I'm going to talk today about a 3-day-long cage incarceration scene I had, and all the different experiences and emotions that went on with that in a 6 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot space. I guess to start off, I have been hugely into like GIMP aesthetic, really leaning heavy into like rubber coverage and objectification, dehumanization stuff. That's kind of always been where my interests have lied.
This form of freedom, negative freedom, is value neutral. The lowest common denominator very quickly begins to rule, and society becomes obsessed with the pursuit of their most base desires. A society obsessed with freedom becomes a society obsessed with hedonism, consumerism, and sexuality.
As long as you don't record, by the way. So ABDL involves adult, baby, diaper, little. That's what it means. So the whole point is to be little, but you're still an adult and you just wear baby stuff, including, of course, wearing a diaper, obviously. That makes sense?
This retreat is full of the sexiest people in the world.
Three little quesadillas? What's happening?
I would rate myself a 10 out of 10.
Bring that here, reel it in.
This is literally heaven on earth.
Cheers to sexy people. Cheers, guys.
I'm Lana.
Plot twist.
Go team.
There are conditions to your stay here.
Bloody hell.
No kissing or sex of any kind.
Oh, shit.
Dear Netflix, my culture is not your costume. The contradictions here quickly become visible. This is because there's no such thing as equal opportunity hedonism. Hedonism requires slaves. Luxury requires someone to compare yourself to. This is why left-wing millennials tend to be extremely uncomfortable admitting basic facts about social life, like physical attractiveness existing. If sexuality has an inherently unfair element to it, which everyone knows it does, then everyone pursuing hedonism could not create an equal society. Someone has to show restraint, either the losers or the winners. Hedonism also makes the people who practice it miserable. They're always looking for the next high, and they're constantly feeling empty, and are probably the most terrified of death due to the fact that they have very little connection to anything lasting or transcendent. The human desire for luxury is once again what prevents us from achieving Socrates' vision of communism. And I personally think some of the most vocally left-wing people are the ones least capable of creating the kind of society they claim to want. They avoid the fact that in order to improve society, help people, or improve your life, you have to make decisions which accomplish those aims. You have to be nice to people you're not trying to fuck. But Democrats aren't particularly interested in the idea they have to do anything. They believe whatever they're doing is the right thing, as long as they're free to do it. Therefore, as social problems continue to pile up due to society's inability to govern or elect competent leaders, the Democrats assume that society simply isn't free enough. This is why left-wing people have been obsessed with dismantling perceived hierarchies for decades now. They're committed to the idea that social problems must come from an outside force, that the average person has no accountability for how society turns out whatsoever. But ultimately, they always lose the argument to the right, because the ultimate expression of id, in the Freudian sense, is arguably fascism. Kink elevated to the highest principle of society.
What's the trouble, sir? Oh, no. Well. If it isn't little Alex. Long time no viddy, Drew. How goes?
It's impossible. I don't believe it. Evidence of the old glasses. Nothing up our sleeve. No magic, little Alex. A job for two who are now of job age.
Tyranny, the final and worst stage of Plato's regime cycle, occurs whenever a dictator comes to power in order to solve the chaos of a collapsing democratic society, and a sort of dark reflection of the aristocracy. It's more than that, though. It may have sounded like I was describing democracy as a society based around desire, but it isn't. As I said at the beginning, it's a transition phase, like oligarchy was. Platonic democracy is hypocritical and self-contradictory on the surface, but it does value something: freedom. This creates dysfunction and chaos. But what rises from the ashes is the true society of lust. The kind of desire that doesn't really believe in or care about restraint or freedom or honor. The society will of course tend towards one person ruling over all, with all of society being his slaves, and the tyrant himself being a slave to his own desires, slowly destroying his own life and alienating himself from his humanity. As I said, Plato's understanding of politics is about values more than institutions, and in this cycle, it's important to note we have gone from one-man rule to one-man rule, but the differences couldn't be any more stark. Gen Z's support of authoritarianism has been well documented, whether it's support of fascism or communism or some other ideology. The way I see it, people are broken, society's broken, many people don't know what they're living for, and they just want the chaos, internal and external, to stop. They want to feel like they have a place in the world, and they increasingly don't care how we get there. Yay! Well, I think there's definitely elements of truth to the regime cycle. This video is more of a thought experiment than anything else. I don't think that any philosopher should be adhered to dogmatically. Socrates and Plato were very brilliant, but I also think there were things they were wrong about. Like I said, Plato believed in gender equality. I'm sorry, I genuinely apologize for that remark. I don't believe that. I'm sorry. Furthermore, there's obviously many exceptions to the descriptions of each generation here. For every money-obsessed, evangelical baby boomer, there's a Hunter S. Thompson. For every thought slime, there's going to be a Sam Hyde and a Nick Mullen out there. These generational cycles are about aggregates, and I think you have a choice about which type of person you are. It may only be a small number of people in most of these generations that actually embody the generational ethos, but the point is that if that's the case, they're the most powerful and set the cultural standards. That being said, it seems to be almost universally agreed upon that there's a political crisis going on in the US right now, although people can't seem to agree on what that crisis is, which only adds to the chaos. People have cited low birth rates, climate change, runaway inflation, higher suicide rates, higher rates of political violence, income inequality, and lower quality of life as signs of societal decline, or just a general decline in the nature of political discourse. Regardless of what the true cause or effects are, at the end of the day, there's just a general feeling that something is very wrong. Of course, when you come from the opposite side, people will say nothing is wrong, but when they're talking to people on their side, they'll say everything is wrong. Many Gen Z also broke with previous generations of young people in voting Republican for Trump, who many view as having at least authoritarian tendencies. Both sides of the aisle seem to be increasingly polarized and to be developing authoritarian tendencies in their own right. If the regime cycle is real and we can change it, economic solutions may not help us in the long term. We could have a balanced budget, low cost of living, etc., but if people no longer believe in good, if people have no ideals or values they're striving towards, then we're likely just going to be in the same place again within a few decades. The solution, if there is one, is to make politics about morality again, good and evil, right and wrong. Some of you are probably thinking, well, that's not saying much. Isn't modern politics just people arguing about what's right and wrong? To which I'd say, no, not really. That language is often used as a justification, but what seems to be the real most common argument is actually inevitability. Whether it's white supremacists arguing race war is inevitable, techno-feudalists arguing monarchy is inevitable, or Marxists arguing communism is inevitable, they're all essentially telling you that you don't matter, you don't have agency, and you have to do what they say because you're just too weak in the face of their big ideas and plans. People need to recognize that we have a choice about how society turns out. People need to recognize that they as individuals have a choice about how their own life turns out. There's things that you can't control, but to the extent that you can control how you react to what life throws at you, you have power to alter that. That's pretty much it, I guess. I don't know if that's a terribly helpful suggestion, but I hope that this video has brought some kind of maybe awareness of history or a new perspective or some kind of insight about where we're going as a culture. That's pretty much all I can hope for. So thank you very much for watching.